The Slender Stalker is known by many names, but no matter what you call him, one thing is common: everyone fears him. This is the story. It all begins on one snowy night deep within the forested mountains of the Minecraft world. And while it might have looked like a desolate wasteland, with nature being in complete control, devouring any forms of intelligent life that ever dared to step forth onto its land, that wasn't entirely the case, as hidden away in that forest was a small log cabin, home to an innocent Steve. Now, that Steve had lived there in that log cabin for years, all without issue. Well, that was until that night, as it was on that dark night while the Steve was just lying asleep on his soft, silky bed that his cabin was somehow set ablaze. But since he was asleep, and that cabin was tiny, and the mysterious fire had started on the opposite side to where he was resting, he didn't realize that there was a fire until it was far too late, as he only came aware of that fire when it reached him and began to engulf him. And so, because of that, he began to burn from those flames and began to suffocate from the smoke. This was it. This was his end, and there was nothing that he could do to save himself, as he didn't know what started this fire, nor did he know how to extinguish it. And so, it didn't take too long before his world went dark. However, after a few years, he somehow regained consciousness, but he was trapped in a giant glass tube, and hundreds of villagers were surrounding him, staring at him, and they were all performing a sort of ritual upon him, as they were throwing potions at him and chanting something. He was so confused. Why was this happening? But then, that Steve looked at the reflection on the glass, and he was horrified with what he saw, as he realized that his body was covered in burns, and he was only being kept alive due to all those things that were connected to him by the illagers. He also saw that most of his face had melted off, but he could still see, somehow. This was strange, very strange, as he should be dead. And so he just watched on as the illagers carried out their strange ritual, until suddenly the glass shattered and he fell to the floor. Instantly, pain consumed every fibre of his being, as he felt like he was on fire again and that he was going to die. But as he stood there, slowly dying, the evokers began to walk towards him, all yelling out something that he just couldn't understand, while the Vindicators watched from behind, whispering how he was the one that they had predicted in all their prophecies. Again, that Steve was confused, but really, all he could do was just stand there, consumed in pain and sorrow, knowing that he was doomed. Well, that was until one of those evokers touched him, because at that moment, his pain suddenly stopped. Instead, he felt a sudden wave of power surge through him, and thus, he felt like a god. And well, he partially was, as it was on that moment that he gained numerous abilities, from the powers to see through walls, teleport, start fires with just his mind, could see into the future, and most interestingly, he gained the ability to see the invisible, suffering souls of the world. But despite all that, his body wasn't healing from all those burns, and so those burns covered his appearance. But not for too long, as one of the illusionists came forward and gave that Steve a black suit. Now, he was a bit suspicious of that gift, but at the same time, he had nothing to lose, and so he accepted that gift and wore it. And well, he loved it, as that suit was so soft and flexible, and it just made his wounds feel better. Also, they covered him, so he no longer looked like an ugly, burned Steve. And that tie just made him feel so sophisticated. It was amazing. However, before he was able to thank those villagers for saving him and giving him all these powers and gifting him that suit, a bolt of lightning struck that mansion, and in a mere few minutes, the entirety of that mansion was engulfed in flames. Now, that Steve was just so traumatized by seeing fire that he teleported away as fast as he possibly could, as he just couldn't bear to look back at those flames, as the mere sight of fire just pained him, as all he could see was suffering. And so after that, he began to run away from that mansion as fast and as far as possible. Now, he didn't know where he was running to, but he just didn't know what else he could do. And so just a few hours later, he ended up in a giant ice spikes biome. And so it was then that he stopped and began to take in this magical sight, as for the first time ever, he could see the Aurora Borealis, and he could hear the flowing water on a nearby frozen river, and he could see the tiny white rabbits playing in the soft snow. It was amazing, as he had never seen so much beauty within the world. But then he saw it, a flock of alays flying by that river. He was shocked, as he had never seen so many of them in a single place, and he could also see that none of them had a single particle of suffering around them. They were just joyful beings. And so that Steve then went over to them to observe them more closely. However, when he tried to get closer to them, he stopped paying attention to the ground that he was standing on, and so for that reason, he didn't realize that there was a hole in that frozen river, and thus he fell into it. And due to the strong currents of that river, he was pushed away from that escape. Now, he tried to teleport out, but he couldn't teleport 3 blocks, and so for that reason, he was trapped under the ice. This was it. He was doomed. After all that he had just gone through, this was how he was going to die. But no, he couldn't give up, and so he began to swim up, trying to punch that ice as hard as he possibly could. And in just a few minutes, he was luckily able to make an escape. However, he couldn't get to it, as the strong currents were pushing him away from it. No, this truly was it. He was going to die. And so that Steve just closed his eyes, bracing for death to arrive. But it was then that the alays flew through that hole and made their way over to the drowning Steve. And they saved him, as they all worked together to lift him up and take him out of that river. It was amazing. However, once they were all out of that river, the alays didn't let go. No, instead, they all continued to pull on him, and as they were all going in different directions, he was being torn apart. Now, he tried to teleport away, but that just didn't work, and so he kept on becoming slender and slender. Oh no, maybe the alays weren't as good and righteous as they seemed, as they were going to kill him because they were still tearing him apart and there was nothing that he could do. But then, all of a sudden, they let go and began to fly away. And so, that Steve fell down to the ground. Now, that hurt. But he was just grateful to be alive. And he knew that he would likely go back to his normal size in due time. However, as he stood there in the ice spikes, it began to snow. And so he began to feel very cold. And he didn't like that. And so using some of his powers, he was able to create a fire using just his mind. However, that was a very foolish idea, because he was petrified of fire, and so when he saw that fire, he just began to run away from it in fear. However, as he didn't deactivate his mind powers, he created a line of fire that followed him as he ran. But then he backed up into a tree, and because he was still activating that mind fire ability, he was set on fire once again. This was it. He was going to die now, as he knew that this fire was going to kill him. But again, not quite, as he survived because he was able to teleport away and was able to deactivate his mind fire ability. Also, due to that snow, the fire that engulfed him was quickly extinguished. However, due to all that he had just gone through, his new stretched body had just been set and was now permanent. But not only that, as his skin also turned pure white, as all that stretching combined with that freezing cold resulted in a loss of colour in his body. But despite all those changes, he survived and was stable. Also, it didn't really matter to him being a Slender Man, as his life really wouldn't be that different, as he could just build a taller house. It's not that big a deal. And so it was then that he decided to head back to his small log cabin, as he was just curious to know what happened to it, and what remained of it, and whether or not he could still live in it. And so, over the next few weeks, he travelled across the snowy tundra, and the icy mountain peaks, and the subscribe button fields, and the freezing rivers, all until he returned to that isolated cabin in the forest. But what he saw when he arrived there horrified him, as he saw that his cabin was in complete ruin, far beyond repair. But that was to be expected. There was quite a large fire, after all. But that's not what horrified him. No, as what truly horrified him was a flint and steel lying beside the charred remains of his cabin. And so, this meant that that fire was not natural, but instead an intentional act by someone or something aimed at hurting him. And so, he then began to look around his cabin to see if there were any other clues about who or what did this. And well, there were, as he saw a set of tools lying by his house, but they were not his, and he knew whose tools they were, as those tools were only used by one other being, that being the villagers. But still, he knew he couldn't be too quick to blame them, as maybe they were stolen. However, just a few blocks away was something that proved to him that those were not stolen tools, and that the villagers did do this, as he saw a sleeping cat. And well, as that cat was tamed, it must be from a village. And so, he was outraged, as why did the villagers do this? But he couldn't see an obvious answer, and so for that reason, he decided that before he released his rage onto the villagers, he needed to find out the truth. And thus, over the next few hours, he travelled thousands of blocks until he had sights on the closest village. And luckily, as it was sunrise, all the villagers were starting to wake up. And so he slowly strolled his way into that village, and he tried to be as calm and upbeat as possible, as this was probably all a misunderstanding. However, as he walked through those streets, he was mocked, laughed at, or just avoided. They were treating him like scum. But still, he remained positive and began to ask questions to the villagers. However, when he did that, he received no responses. He didn't like that, but still, he continued to ask more and more villagers why they did this, all with no responses. Well, that was until one villager ordered the Iron Golem to kill him. Now, the Iron Golem was unable to do that, as he was able to fight back and kill him with relative ease. But because of that, his hypothesis of the villagers being the ones that burnt his house down was proved, as no innocent and set-up party would ever act like this. And so he saw red, and he wanted revenge onto the villagers for all that he had gone through. And thus, fueled with anger and disappointment, he began to kill every single villager in that village, and there was no escape for any of them. But not just that, he also killed them in the most brutal way possible, as he would take each villager and isolate them in a realm of shadows, tormenting them with the souls that they caused suffering to throughout their lives. And then he would slowly begin to rip out their organs one by one. But he would also be healing them along the way, and so they were kept alive in a constant state of pain and suffering for a very long time. But then, finally, just when they were about to die from their injuries and the lack of organs, he would force them to feel all the pain that they'd experienced in their life over and over and over, thousands of times, until it was too much and they died a long, painful death. And he did that for all of the villagers, as this was his revenge. But after ridding the overworld of all those villagers, he was not finished with his mission of revenge. No, as he wanted to strike fear and suffering into the hearts of all villagers throughout the world, and he didn't plan to stop until all villagers knew him and feared him. And thus, he began to travel to villages all across the world in all different biomes, where he would then force all the villagers to suffer the same fate as the original. And so, due to all this pain and suffering that he was inflicting onto the world, it didn't take too long before legends would begin to spread of him. Now, the villagers did give him many names, but one of the most common was the Slender, Stalker from the shadows. And just as he wanted, they all feared him. So much so that many villagers began to remove all the lights within their homes, thinking that that would save them from that monster. But it wouldn't, as the lack of lights only helped the Slender Stalker, as the light was his weakness, and he could still sense the suffering souls of the villagers from miles away, and he could smell their fear. And thus, he was able to kill more villagers than ever before, and was able to inflict just so much suffering onto the world. But soon, things were going to change, as the villagers decided that in order to please the Slender Stalker, so that he would spare their lives, they needed to offer him something. But what could they offer? And so the villagers thought about it, and they thought about it, and they thought about it, until they finally had an idea. As what else would be better to that demon than a sacrifice? And so, for that reason, thousands of villagers began to release young villagers into cages, and they surrounded their villagers in those cages, and they made it very clear where they were. Now, the Slender Stalker was shocked by their actions, but he was grateful nonetheless, as they were making his job easier. And so he graciously decided to accept those sacrifices in the villages when given, and would in fact leave the rest of them alone when he received one. And so, once news of that broke out, millions of villagers began to set up sacrifices around their villages for the Slender Stalker to take. However, even though villagers could save themselves by offering sacrifices, many still decided not to participate in that, as they just saw it as immoral and evil and just wrong. But their moral attitudes didn't matter to the Slender Stalker, as if he came to a village and there was no sacrifice waiting for him, well, let's just say the village didn't do so well. And so the Slender Stalker was finally getting his revenge, as he had killed in excess of 1 million villagers, causing mass terror and suffering across the world. And so he was very happy with his life. But once again, very soon, things were going to change. But this time, not in his favor, as it was getting close to Halloween. And so all the villagers were starting to put up decorations. Now, that might sound normal, but bear in mind, they had been hiding in the dark from the Slender Stalker for over 50 years at this point. And so, none of them had put up any sort of decorations for a very long time. Now, their reasoning for doing all that was that they just wanted a day to commemorate the dead souls that had been lost due to that stalker. And they just wanted to have that individual day within the year when they could reclaim their freedom and not fear the Slender Stalker. Now, for the most part, this whole idea didn't really work out too well, as the Slender Stalker still came forth from the shadows and would just kill them all if they failed to leave him as sacrifice. However, this was still a momentous success for the villagers, as it marked the beginning of their counterattack and resistance against that monster. Now, this was all a very gradual process, but over the next 100 years, life returned to normal for the villagers. As they began to put back all their lights, they stopped doing all the sacrifices, and they began to live just normal lives, accepting that if the Slender Stalker came to them, then so be it. That was their fate. Now, this frustrated the Slender Stalker quite a lot, as his whole mission of revenge was dedicated on causing terror and suffering. And it was starting to fail, as all that light that the villagers were putting up was starting to hurt him, and so he wasn't even able to fight back against the villagers as efficiently. And because they were all just so happy now, it was harder to spot them, as he did rely on the beacons of suffering that they released and the smell of fear to find them. And so things were not looking good for the Slender Stalker, and they were only getting worse. As one night, while he ravaged a snowy village, he was spotted by a set of beings that had never seen him before. Those being the Pillagers, as they had an outpost not too far from that village, and they were stalking the village themselves when the Slender Stalker invaded it. And so, because no other illager had heard of him before, legends began to spread rather quickly across the illager world about him. And thus, it didn't take too long before a set of evokers decided that they wanted him. And so, an order was sent out across the world to all villagers, commanding them to bring back that monster to the mansion, be it dead or alive, as he was clearly something of interest to them. However, over the next 20 years, not a single villager ever saw that monster, as his attacks had become so infrequent as his empire of terror was crumbling. But soon, one pillager was able to spot him in the distance while they were on patrol duty within a jungle. And so that pillager ran after him as fast as he possibly could, and he begged for the Slender Stalker to come with him. But before he could even finish speaking to him, the Slender Stalker just vanished into the shadows. That was annoying. He had just lost his only opportunity to collect him. However, when he was walking back to his outpost, he saw something that would change his life forever, as he saw a small cutout of his suit caught up on a tree. And so that pillager ran over to it and he picked it up. And so after that, he ran back to the mansion holding up that cutting from his suit. And then he gave it to the evokers. And well, the evokers, after running some tests on it, uncovered the source of this strange monster's powers. And well, it was from the evokers. They were shocked, as they didn't know what had been done to allow an evoker to create the Slender Stalker and allow for all those powers to be granted to him. And so, it was then that the evokers ordered the collection of an iron golem, as they had an idea, because they were planning to recreate the Slender Stalker using the iron golem as their template to do so. As if they could succeed in that, well then they could create an army of Slender Stalkers, and with that they could rule the world. And so, to find out what happened next, you'll need to watch this video.